significant benefit of lockdowns on case growth in any country. There are other papers that I say continue in that theme, but I'll quote one more because it's to do with adults living with kids. Remember, we shut schools because we were scared that kids would come home and infect older people who then die. Well, this paper in the BMG found no evidence, quotes, no evidence of an increased risk of severe COVID-19 outcomes. We shut down society, we shut down schools, just in case, doing extraordinary harm to the lives of people, especially young people. I'm not a lockdown skeptic, as Ferguson casually described some of his critics, but I'm becoming so. And do you know why, Mr. Chair? Because I read the evidence. And I read a growing body of evidence that suggests that if you take country examples, in fact, there's one quote that I didn't read out. There was a study of lots of countries that had lockdowns, lots of countries that didn't, and the data was inconclusive. Coming through to the third element of the scandal, the recent modelling. Swedish epidemiologists looked at Imperial's work, and they compared it with experience. Their chief epidemiologist, Angus Tengel, said of Imperial's work, the variables were quite extreme, always quite doubtful. Former chief epidemiologist Johan Gisek said Ferguson's models was, quotes, almost hysterical. In the House of Lords, Viscount Ridley talked of a huge discrepancy and flaws in the model and the modelling. Yet John Ioannidis from Stanford University said assumptions and estimates seemed substantially inflated. There was the second example last summer. In July 2021, the good Professor Ferguson predicted that hitting 100,000 cases was almost inevitable, he said. The real question is, do we get to double that or even higher, he told the BBC. And that's where the crystal ball starts to fail. Well, we got nowhere near 200,000, we got nowhere near 100,000. There was nothing inevitable about Professor Ferguson's inevitability, and his crystal ball must have gone missing from the start. He blamed, in the Times, he blamed the Euros for messing his modelling because, shock horror, during the competition, people went to pubs a lot to watch the games, and shock horror, when the tournament finished, they didn't. And that seems to be the fundamental problem, where reality comes up against models, reality steamrollers models, because models cannot cope with the complexity of real life. And to pretend that they can, and even that they are useful, when so many of them have proved not to be, is concerning. Ferguson is only one of many people, an independent sage especially, but also sage, who did not cover themselves in glory. And Raghib Ali, a friend of the Honourable Member for High Wycombe, I'm delighted he's here as ever, one of the heroes of COVID, noted that many left-wing sage members repeatedly made inaccurate forecasts overestimating infections. And very often they were falsely described on the BBC. And for the record,
I'm very grateful to him for mentioning my friend and constituent Raghib Ali. He has indeed been one of the absolute heroes of this pandemic, not only in his advice to us all, but online indeed, but also in serving in hospitals. But I have to say, I hope he won't mind me saying, I don't think any of us can speak for Raghib on his opinion of modelling, and I know my own friend isn't trying to.
I quite agree, and thank you very much indeed for that, but I'm deeply grateful for him and other people for speaking out. And just for the record, Suzanne Michie, the communist Suzanne Michie, quoted quite often on the BBC, is neither a medical doctor nor a virologist nor an epidemiologist. She's a health psychologist. So why on earth she's talking about epidemiology, I'm not quite sure. Third, this winter, Imperial, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and others, I think Warwick predicted, 5,000 daily COVID deaths, 3,000 daily deaths with the best case scenario. They were hopelessly inaccurate. And at this point, the tide really begins to turn. So Dr. Clive Dix, the former vaccine task force head, it's bad science, and I think they're being irresponsible. They have a duty to reflect the true risks, but this is just headline grabbing. The tide, as I say, is turning. Oncology professor Angus Dalgleish describes Ferguson's modelling as lurid predictions and spectacularly wrong. The great Carl Hennigan, another scientist who has emerged with great credit for his honesty and fairness of comment, says it's becoming clearer that all ministers see now is the worst case scenario. And Professor Brendan Wren quotes, dodgy data and flawed forecasts have become the hallmark of much of the scientific establishment. What a damning quote. But I'll continue. Which has traded almost exclusively in worst case scenarios. This must stop now. I agree. What's the result of all this? I'm going to wind up in the next 2 to 3 minutes. I will speak for no longer than 15 minutes because there are other people who wish to get in, and I'm always mindful of that. The result, as UCL's Professor Francois Ballieu notes, is a loss of trust in government and public institutions for crying wolf. And that's just it. Hysterical forecasts, models taken out of context, worst case scenarios normalized. In the army, there's something called the most dangerous course of action, and there's something called most likely course of action. And effectively, if you want to sum up with one sentence on how we've got this wrong, we have taken the most dangerous course of action, and we collectively, politicians, the media, the scientists, the health professionals, we have presented that as the most likely course of action, and it was not. It was not. Why did politicians say follow the science as a way of shutting down debate when we know that science is complex and your outputs are dependent on your inputs? Public health types whose defensive decision-making would only ever cost other people's jobs, other people's health, other people's sanity, other people's education, and other people's life chances. We know that the opposition supported lockdown from the word go. A little bit more opposing, I think, might have been helpful. And the BBC and the Guardian salivating on state control and doomsday scenarios, and against this tsunami of hysteria and fear, thank God for the Spectator, the Telegraph, and yes, the Daily Mail, for keeping alive freedom of speech and putting an alternative which is now being increasingly scientifically vindicated. I understand that lockdown was understandable at first. I get that. But I believe the continuation of lockdown after that first summer was an increasingly flawed decision. And so wrapping up, I've got some questions to Professor Ferguson and the doomsday modelers. Why are so many of your fellow academics disputing your work and your findings? To the BBC, as our state broadcaster, why did you so rarely challenge Ferguson, Sage, or Independent Sage? Why did we misrepresent experts, and why did it allow itself to become the propaganda arm of the lockdown state? To government, how could we have been so blinkered to think that following the science meant shutting down scientific debate? Why did we never use other data sets in context with the British people, or even in context when it came to making these profound and enormous decisions? And why did we think it was in our nation's interest to create a grotesque sense of fear to manipulate behaviour? To Sage and Independent Sage, well, they kept on getting it wrong very often. And to the public health types, I just quote from Professor Angus Dalgleish again. Flailing around, wallowing in hysteria, adopting impractical policies and subverting democracy, the chief medical officer is out of his depth. He has to go if we are ever to escape this nightmare. It's not a journalist, it's an oncologist and a senior oncologist. Twice in 20 years, we have made some pretty profound and significant errors of judgment using modelling as a sort of glorified guesswork. And I would suggest, respectfully to government, after foot-and-mouth and after COVID, never again should government rely on dubious modelling, regardless of the source and regardless of the best intent. I'm sure Imperial and all these other people do the best they can. I'm very happy to state that publicly. But why has so much of their work been described, and I will use the words of other academics, as unvalidated, flawed, not fit for purpose, improbable, almost hysterical, overconfident, lurid, inflated, pessimistic, spectacularly wrong, fraudulent, and scientific opportunism? Thank you.
Question.